The engineer's name was Thomas Rosser, and on the morning of August 4th, 1872, he was standing on the south bank of the Yellowstone River in what is now eastern Montana, watching the grass move. Not the wind. The grass does not move that way in a wind. It bends in one direction and stays bent. What Rosser was watching moved in a long, shifting ripple, the way water disturbs under something swimming just below the surface. It moved from west to east across the bench above the river, following the line of a dry creek bed that wound down toward the cottonwoods. And then it stopped, and the grass was still, and nothing was there. Rosser was the chief engineer for the Northern Pacific Railroad's Western Survey. He had spent 4 years in the Confederate Army, survived Gettysburg, commanded a cavalry division under Jeb Stuart, and ridden through the smoke of more engagements than he could count. He was not a man who frightened easily. He stood on that riverbank for several minutes looking at the bench above him. He wrote about what he saw later in his expedition diary, which has survived. He wrote that in that moment, watching the grass go still, he felt something he had not felt since the war. He did not name it directly. He did not have to. Any man who has ever been watched by someone he cannot see knows the name. 30 miles to the west, on the Powder River, the largest gathering of Lakota and Northern Cheyenne warriors assembled in years was breaking camp. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. To understand why a party of trained military surveyors operating under a full cavalry escort in the summer of 1872 was afraid, you have to understand what the Northern Pacific Railroad actually meant. Not to the shareholders in Philadelphia or the politicians in Washington who had authorized it, but to the land it was being drawn across on paper. The land that the Lakota and their Cheyenne and Arapaho allies had held, hunted, and defended for a century. The Northern Pacific was going to be the second transcontinental railroad. The first, the Union Pacific and Central Pacific Line, had been completed in 1869 at Promontory Summit in Utah Territory. That line ran across the southern edge of the Great Plains and through the deserts of Nevada and Utah. It had caused enormous suffering, primarily among the Chinese laborers who built the western half, but it had not cut through the heart of the northern hunting grounds. The Northern Pacific would. Its route ran west from Duluth, Minnesota, across the Dakota Territory, through the Yellowstone Valley in Montana, over the Rocky Mountains, and down to Puget Sound on the Pacific coast. In 1868, the government had signed the Treaty of Fort Laramie with the Lakota and their allies. The treaty had ended Red Cloud's War, the conflict that had begun with the Fetterman fight on Lodge Trail Ridge 2 years earlier, and it had conceded almost everything the Lakota had demanded. The Bozeman Trail was closed. The Army forts in the Powder River country were abandoned and burned. The Black Hills were formally recognized as part of the Great Sioux Reservation. The Powder River Basin itself, that vast stretch of rolling grassland between the Black Hills and the Bighorn Mountains, was designated unceded Indian territory, meaning it did not become a reservation, but it also did not become United States land. The Lakota retained the right to hunt there as long as the buffalo remained. The buffalo remained. In the summer of 1872, they remained in numbers so large that survey teams described riding for hours through herds that stretched to both horizons. The Lakota herds, the people's horses, grazed alongside them. The camps followed the buffalo north in late spring and south again in autumn, the same pattern they had followed since the Lakota had come to the plains and received horses in the generations before living memory. The Northern Pacific's route went directly through all of it. Jay Cook, the Philadelphia banker who was financing the railroad's construction, knew the land he was asking his survey crews to walk across. He knew Sitting Bull had sent word through an emissary named Spotted Eagle in 1872, traveling to Fort Sully to deliver the message to Colonel David Stanley directly. The Lakota had not given permission for a railroad through their territory. If the survey continued, there would be war. Cook pressed forward anyway. He needed the route laid out. He needed investors to believe the line was viable. He needed the survey completed. So in the summer of 1872, 2 columns of surveyors set out. One from Fort Rice in Dakota Territory under Major Eugene Baker, one from Fort Ellis in Montana under an engineer named Frederick Linton. Between them, they were supposed to map the middle section of the route, the 250 miles from present-day Billings east to Glendive along the Yellowstone. Their military escort numbered nearly 1,000 men. It was not enough. Not because the warriors outnumbered the soldiers, though at the Big Bend of the Powder River that summer, they very nearly did. It was not enough because the army had spent 4 years fighting the Lakota in the Powder River country and had still not grasped the essential fact that made every campaign in that country so difficult. The Lakota could move a city in an afternoon. Think about what that means. A winter camp of the Hunkpapa Lakota under Sitting Bull might hold 300 lodges. That is not a camp in the way a soldier or a surveyor understood the word. It is a functioning community with its own social order and its own physical infrastructure. Each lodge required 17 poles, the principal 3 running perhaps 25 feet in length and weighing close to 400 pounds together. The buffalo hide cover of a single teepee ran to another 150 pounds. The cooking tools, the food stores, the robes and clothing and medicine bundles and ceremonial objects that a family carried represented the accumulated property of a household. A Lakota woman could break down her family's lodge in less than an hour. The poles were lashed into a travois frame across a horse's back, 2 poles on each side dragging behind, the hide cover and household goods bundled between them. The children climbed on top. The old people rode. The horse pulled everything. And then the entire community moved, not in the straggling, supply-burdened way of an army column, but in a long, steady column of its own, organized by band and by family, following trails that the community had known for generations, trails that a surveyor's team from Philadelphia could not have found on its best day. A full camp of 300 lodges, horses and dogs and all, could cover 12 to 15 miles in a day's march without straining. A smaller hunting group of warriors traveling light could cover 50 miles or more. There is documented testimony from Army officers during the Great Sioux War of 1876 estimating that crazy horses people could strike, disengage, and be 30 miles away before a cavalry column could saddle and form up in pursuit. This was not an accident. It was the product of a century of adaptation to the northern plains, an adaptation so complete that mobility had become not merely a tactic but a way of life, a value, a philosophy. The teepee itself was designed around it. The Lakota word for the dwelling, teepee, means something close to used to live in, which is perhaps the most elegant encapsulation of a mobile world that language has ever produced. You did not live in a place. You had lived there. The living was always already moving toward somewhere else. Thomas Rosser stood on the bank of the Yellowstone in August of 1872 and watched the grass. He had been in Lakota country for 3 months. He had covered something like 400 miles. He had had his horses run off in a night raid so quiet that the sentries heard nothing until the herd was already gone. He had ridden through country where the depressions in the grass and the ash circles of dead fires showed where a camp of hundreds had sat 3 days before, and where there was now nothing at all but the wind and the meadowlarks. He had sent scouts north and south and come back with reports of movement in every direction and certainty in none. He had begun to understand something about the country he was in that the men in the offices back east had not yet understood. The land was not empty. The land was inhabited by people who had mastered the art of being everywhere and nowhere at once. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The 1872 survey was not a success. The 2 columns never met at their planned rendezvous point at the mouth of the Powder River. Baker's column out of Fort Rice was turned back by a series of skirmishes and harassing attacks that the Army's formal reports described as inconclusive, but that the Lakota themselves, in interviews given many years later, described as exactly what they were, a sustained effort to slow, exhaust, and ultimately discourage the survey party from completing its work. When Baker wrote his final report that autumn, he was careful with his language. He noted the difficulty of the terrain. He mentioned the heat. He acknowledged the Indian presence. He did not say what the diary entries of the men who rode with him said more plainly, that the Lakota had frustrated a 1,000-man army expedition by the simple and apparently inexhaustible tactic of being unpredictable, appearing in force when they were supposed to be elsewhere, disappearing before a response could be mounted, and always moving. The 1873 expedition was larger. Colonel David Stanley commanded the overall force, with Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer second in command of the cavalry. The survey party itself numbered 353 civilians. The military escort stood at 1,530 men. They carried 3 artillery pieces, 275 mule-drawn wagons, and 60 days' rations. It was by some measures the largest military column the Army had put into the field on the northern plains since the end of the Civil War. On the first morning out of Fort Abraham Lincoln, before the column had traveled 5 miles, Sioux warriors struck the advance guard. It was over in an hour. The warriors disengaged and vanished. The column continued west. What followed over the next 3 months was not a campaign in the conventional sense. There were engagements, several of them significant. On August 4th, Custer's cavalry was attacked near the Yellowstone in a fight that lasted most of an afternoon, and that Custer, in the dispatches he sent back to Eastern newspapers, described in language that newspapers around the country reprinted under headlines about Sioux aggression. On August 11th, near the mouth of the Bighorn, a second engagement ended when Custer led a mounted charge that drove the warriors back. These were real fights. Men died on both sides. But the fight that the surveyors remembered, the fight that showed up in the private letters and journals and diary entries that never made it into Custer's dispatches, was not a fight at all. It was a conversation between the survey party and the country it was crossing, and the country was saying something the Army did not yet know how to hear. The engineers needed to work slowly. Surveying requires fixed points, precise measurements, instruments leveled and plumbed on ground that has to stay still. A survey transit cannot function while the operator is watching the ridgeline for movement. A chain crew cannot hold their stations when the men in front of them are unsure where the next brush line begins. The work was designed for an empty landscape, for land that held still while men walked across it measuring distances and elevations. The Powder River country in 1873 did not hold still. The warriors did not attack the survey crews directly, not often. What they did was something more effective. They watched. They sent out scouts who stayed just inside the edge of visibility, just far enough away that a clear shot was impossible, just close enough that the men with the instruments could see them and know they were being seen. They ran off the horses when the opportunity came. They burned the grass ahead of the column, which in late summer meant the livestock had nothing to eat. They appeared in the morning on the ridgeline to the north and were on the ridgeline to the south by afternoon, which meant either there were more of them than anyone had estimated or they were moving with a speed that the cavalry could not match on loaded horses with an infantry column behind them. One surveyor wrote in a letter to his wife that riding out from camp each morning felt like stepping out of a door into a house where someone else lived, where the furniture was arranged in ways he did not understand, and where the rooms kept rearranging themselves while he was not looking. He was trying to describe something for which he did not have the right vocabulary. He was trying to describe the experience of being a slow thing in a landscape designed for fast ones. The Lakota had been on the northern plains in the horse culture for roughly a century by 1873. They had arrived on the plains as woodland people, on foot, following game on foot the way their grandparents' had done for 10,000 years. The horse had changed everything, not slowly, not gradually, but in the space of a generation or two, with the speed of a people who recognized what the horse offered and built an entire civilization around the recognition. By the middle of the 18th century, they held the best buffalo country on the continent. They had taken it from the Crow and the Kiowa and the remnant Iroquois bands not by being more numerous, but by being faster, more mobile, more willing to follow the opportunity wherever it led. The teepee culture itself was a product of that speed. Earlier peoples on the plains had built earth lodge villages, permanent or semi-permanent structures along the river valleys, substantial enough to defend and comfortable enough to winter in. The Lakota built nothing permanent. They had decided, somewhere in the evolution of their culture, that permanence was not a virtue on the plains. The virtue was adaptability. The virtue was the ability to read the season and the grass and the direction of the wind and the behavior of the buffalo and move accordingly, always move accordingly, leaving behind nothing that mattered and carrying with them everything that did. This was the civilization that the Northern Pacific Railroad was going to bisect. When Army officers sat down after the 1873 campaign to write their assessments of the Sioux as a military opponent, some of them were honest about what they had seen. General Alfred Terry, who would command the Dakota Column in the Great Sioux War 3 years later, wrote that the Lakota's mobility was not merely a tactical advantage, but a strategic one of the highest order. An army column, he observed, moved at the speed of its slowest element. The slowest element in any column of the 1870s was the supply wagons. The wagon that carried the day's food and ammunition and forage moved at a walking pace, for miles an hour on a good road, less on the prairie, much less after rain. The column could not outrun its wagons. The Lakota did not have wagons. What the Lakota had was the travois system, the horse-drawn sledge frame that the women had perfected over generations of use. A travois was not elegant. It was not fast in the way a racing horse is fast, but it was extraordinarily efficient for a culture moving everything it owned across a landscape of grass and creek beds and river fords. The poles left drag marks, yes. A good tracker could follow those marks for miles. But the marks only told you where the camp had been. They could not tell you where it was going, because the decision of where to go next was made by the headmen and the women who read the land, and they made it fresh every day, and they made it in response to what they saw and smelled and heard, including what they saw and smelled and heard of the soldiers coming behind them. The 1872 and 1873 surveys were completed, technically. The engineers produced their maps. The Northern Pacific had its route. But the surveys had also produced something else, a body of evidence, in letters and diaries and official dispatches, that the Army commanders who read them carefully found deeply unsettling. The evidence said that in the Powder River country and the Yellowstone Valley, the United States Army was operating in a landscape that belonged to people who understood it better, moved through it faster, and had more to lose by giving it up than the Army had to gain by taking it. Sitting Bull understood all of this very clearly. He had been watching the surveyors the same way they had been watching him, with the same attention, the same calculation. In 1872, he had walked down from the promontory above the survey camp on the Yellowstone, sat himself in the open ground within rifle range of the soldiers, and smoked his pipe. His warriors, who had been about to charge, held back because he told them to. He smoked the pipe slowly, methodically, while bullets kicked up the dirt around him. Then he stood up, tapped out the ash, walked back up the hill, and disappeared. He was making a statement. The statement was about composure, about who controlled the pace of things. The soldiers had rifles and artillery and 1,530 men. And a hunk papa holy man had just sat down in front of all of them in the grass and smoked at his leisure and then left when he was ready. The railroad stalled. The panic of 1873, a financial crash that brought down J. Cook's Bank among hundreds of others, halted Northern Pacific construction for nearly a decade. The Lakota had not caused the panic. The railroad's over-leveraged finances had. But the surveyors' accounts of the resistance in the Yellowstone country had frightened enough investors that bond sales had slowed before the crash, and the crash finished what the fear had started. For 9 years after the 1873 survey, the Northern Pacific did not lay a single mile of track west of the Missouri River. 9 years. 9 years in which the Lakota held the Powder River country and the Yellowstone Valley and the Black Hills. 9 years in which the buffalo herds still came in their enormous seasonal migrations. 9 years in which the camp circles were set up and broken down and moved across the grasslands according to the logic of the land rather than the logic of a map drawn in Philadelphia. It ended in 1874, not because of the railroad, but because of gold. George Armstrong Custer led an expedition into the Black Hills in July and August of that year. 1,000 soldiers, 110 wagons, 70 Indian scouts, 4 reporters, and 2 gold miners. The expedition's official purpose was to find a location for a new army fort. The reporters went along because Custer had a genius for the press, and the press had an appetite for Custer. The gold miners went along because the rumors about mineral deposits in the Black Hills had been circulating for years, and if those rumors were true, the knowledge would be worth something. The rumors were true. By mid-August, Custer had sent back dispatches announcing gold in the hills, gold in paying quantities, gold that a man could find with a tin pan in a day's work along the creek beds. The newspapers published it immediately. By the following spring, thousands of prospectors were moving into the Black Hills in violation of the 1868 treaty. The government sent soldiers to turn them back. The soldiers turned back the ones they could catch. They could not catch them all. By the summer of 1875, it was clear to everyone, in the Lakota camps and in the offices of the Interior Department, that the treaty was functionally dead. The only question was how the ending would come. The government offered to buy the Black Hills. The Lakota refused. The government sent negotiators back with lower offers. The Lakota refused again. Red Cloud, who had grown old and cautious in his years as a reservation chief, tried to navigate between what he knew his people needed and what the government was willing to give. Sitting Bull, who was not a reservation chief and had no intention of becoming one, said simply that the Black Hills were not for sale, that they had never been for sale, that the Wasatch did not have the right to ask. In November of 1875, President Grant's administration issued an ultimatum. All Lakota and Cheyenne bands not on the reservation by January 31, 1876, would be declared hostile and subject to military action. The bands in the Powder River country, Sitting Bull's Hunk Papa, Crazy Horse's Oglala, the Northern Cheyenne Under Two Moon and Dull Knife, received the notice and ignored it. They were in their winter camps, deep in the river valleys where the grass still held and the cottonwoods cut the wind. The January deadline was, as a practical matter, absurd. No band on the northern plains moved in January. The ground was frozen, the passes were closed with snow, the horses were already thin from winter. To move from the Powder River to the reservation in January would have meant leaving the old people and the children to freeze. The ultimatum was not a serious request. It was the legal mechanism for what was coming next. What came next was the Great Sioux War of 1876, and at its center, from beginning to end, was the same problem that had bedeviled the surveyors and the cavalry and every army officer who had operated in the Powder River country for the previous 10 years. The Lakota could move faster than the army could follow. General Philip Sheridan's plan was simple in conception. 3 columns converging on the free-roaming bands from 3 directions, north, south, and east, to drive them onto the reservation or destroy them. Colonel John Gibbon would come from the west out of Fort Ellis in Montana. General George Crook would come from the south out of Fort Fetterman in Wyoming. General Alfred Terry, with Custer commanding the cavalry, would come from the east out of Fort Abraham Lincoln in Dakota. The columns were meant to close simultaneously or near enough that the bands could not escape between them. The plan assumed the bands would be where the Army thought they were. By February of 1876, Army intelligence estimated 500 to 800 Lakota and Northern Cheyenne warriors scattered along the Little Missouri River, 120 miles west of Fort Abraham Lincoln. By March, the bands had moved west. By June, they were camped along the Little Bighorn, a branch of the Yellowstone, in a single vast village of somewhere between 1,500 and 3,000 fighting men, the largest gathering of free-roaming plains warriors that the Northern Plains had seen in a generation. The Army had no intelligence on any of this movement. The columns were marching toward the February estimate, not the June reality. They were 3 large, slow, supply-burdened columns moving across a landscape that had already reorganized itself around their arrival. Crook's column struck first, or tried to. On March 17, 1876, Colonel Joseph Reynolds attacked a village on the Powder River that Reynolds believed to be Crazy Horse's camp. It was not. It was a Northern Cheyenne village under a chief named Old Bear. Reynolds burned the village, seized the horse herd, and pulled back. The Cheyenne recaptured most of their horses the following morning and fled toward the Oglala camp to the east. The Army had struck the wrong people, burned the wrong village, and the survivors had ridden directly to Crazy Horse to report what had happened. The effect was the opposite of intimidation. It was fuel. By June, the bands had gathered. Crook ran into them on the Rosebud on June 17 and fought a disabling engagement that he called inconclusive and that subsequent historians have called a defeat. His column retired to the Tongue River and waited for reinforcements. Terry's column continued west, following the trail of the village. Custer and the 7th Cavalry rode south along the Rosebud to find the Indians and drive them toward Gibbon coming from the north. On June 25, Custer found the village. It was larger than anyone in the Army had imagined. The official estimate before the campaign had placed the number of fighting men in the free-roaming bands at something between 800 and 1,500. The village on the Little Bighorn held, by later estimates, between 1,500 and 3,000. Custer divided his regiment without waiting for Gibbon or for confirmation of the village's size and attacked from multiple directions. The attack collapsed. By the late afternoon, 5 companies of the 7th Cavalry were dead on a bluff above the river, Custer among them. In the weeks after the Little Bighorn, Gibbon chased trails east and found no one. Crook's reinforced column went back into the field and spent most of August covering enormous distances across a burned landscape without finding a significant concentration of warriors anywhere. The great village on the Little Bighorn had dispersed, as all Lakota villages dispersed when it was time to disperse, into smaller bands moving in different directions across a landscape that was far too large for the army to watch all at once. The pursuit stretched into winter. It was only in the winter camps, when the cold forced the bands to stay still, when the horses were too thin to move fast, and the snow gave away tracks, that the Army's superior numbers finally began to matter. Colonel Nelson Miles attacked Crazy Horse's camp in the Wolf Mountains in January of 1877. He did not destroy it, but he drove it north and east, away from its winter stores. Other columns hit other camps. The logic of attrition eventually worked the way attrition always works, not by winning any single battle, but by making it impossible to rest, impossible to feed the horses, impossible to give the children a winter that did not involve constant movement across frozen ground. Crazy Horse surrendered at Fort Robinson in May of 1877. He was 36 years old. He had been fighting the Army in the Powder River country for 10 years. For most of those 10 years, by every honest account in the historical record, he had been winning, or at least not losing. His ability to move his camp, to concentrate his warriors and then dissolve back into the plains, to strike and vanish and reappear somewhere the Army had not expected, had made him one of the most effective military leaders of his era. He was killed at Fort Robinson in September of 1877 during what the Army described as a struggle while being placed under arrest. Lakota witnesses said he was stabbed in the back with a bayonet while held. There is no photograph of him in existence. He did not permit them. Sitting Bull escaped to Canada with a remnant of his band and did not return until 1881, when the buffalo were already gone and surrender was no longer avoidable. The buffalo. It is impossible to talk about Lakota mobility without talking about the buffalo, because the mobility and the buffalo were a single thing. The Lakota did not move because they enjoyed moving. They moved because the buffalo moved, and the buffalo was everything. Food, shelter, clothing, tools, ceremony, economy. The entire way of life was organized around the herd's migration, and the migration made the mobility necessary, and the mobility made the teepee necessary, and the teepee made the horse necessary, and the horse made possible the century of Lakota dominance on the northern plains that the surveyors had encountered on the Yellowstone in 1872. When the hide hunters came to the southern plains in 1872 and 1873, they came with Sharps rifles that could drop a buffalo at 600 yards, and they came with railroad access that let them ship the hides east to tanneries that had figured out how to process bison leather for industrial belt drive systems. The economics were simple and terrible. A single hide was worth $3 on the eastern market. A good hunter could kill 2 or 3 dozen buffalo a day. By 1878, the southern herd, which had numbered in the tens of millions, was effectively gone. By the mid-1880s, the same pattern had played out on the northern plains. The herd that Rosser's survey team had ridden through in 1872, the herd that seemed to stretch to both horizons, was reduced to scattered remnants by 1883. By 1889, the estimated total population of bison on the Great Plains was slightly over 1,000 animals. 1,000 animals, from tens of millions. Without the buffalo, the entire logic of the mobile life collapsed. The teepee required buffalo hides to build. The food stores required buffalo meat to fill. The horses required the grasslands that the buffalo herds had maintained and the mobility that following the buffalo had made necessary. When the buffalo went, the reason for moving went with them, and the mobile life of the northern plains, one of the most complete and sophisticated adaptations to a landscape that human beings have ever produced, had nothing left to move toward. Thomas Rosser went on to have a long career after the 1872 survey. He completed the northern sections of the Northern Pacific Railroad in the 1880s, driving the final spike of the Western Division in September of 1883. He died in 1910 in Charlottesville, Virginia, and is buried there. His expedition diary, with its careful record of the anxiety those weeks on the Yellowstone produced, is preserved among his papers at the University of Virginia. The section about the grass that moves sits between a notation about the forage conditions at that day's camp and a logistical complaint about the wagon axles. David Stanley, who commanded the 1873 expedition, went on to serve in the Army through the 1870s and 1880s. He was present at the Little Bighorn campaign, though not at the battle itself. He retired as a brigadier general and wrote a memoir that included several chapters about the Yellowstone surveys. He was honest in those chapters about the difficulty of operating against an adversary with the Lakota's logistical capability. He wrote that no army he had encountered in the Civil War had been as effectively mobile as the Lakota in their own country. He meant it as a military observation. It was also a description of something older and more profound than military tactics, a civilization's relationship with its land, earned over a century, expressed in every detail of daily life from the 17 poles of a teepee to the drag marks left by a horse travois in the grass of the Yellowstone Valley. The Northern Pacific Railroad was completed on September 8, 1883. Henry Villard, who had taken over the company from the wreckage of Jay Cook's bankruptcy, drove the final spike at Gold Creek, Montana. The celebrations lasted for days. Former President Ulysses Grant was there. William Tecumseh Sherman was there. Various European dignitaries were there. The Dakota Territory through which the line ran had been carved into smaller and smaller reservations over the preceding decade. The Powder River country was no longer unceded Indian territory. It was cattle range, and then wheat farms, and then the grid of section roads and county seats that it is today. Standing at the Gold Creek ceremony in September of 1883, if you had looked north from the tracks toward the Yellowstone, you would have seen grass. Just grass. No smoke from a camp. No ripple in the bench grass above the river. No watchers on the ridge. The great dispersal of bands that Thomas Rosser had sensed watching him from the edge of visibility 11 years before had long since resolved itself into the reservations, Pine Ridge and Rosebud, and Standing Rock and Cheyenne River, the four great agencies of the Great Sioux Reservation. The camps do not move anymore in the old way. There are teepee encampments at ceremonies, at powwows, at the annual Sundance gatherings that have endured, changed in form but not in spirit, across more than a century of suppression and survival. Lakota women still know how to raise a teepee and take it down. The knowledge survived. The deliberate, systematic knowledge of how to live well on the northern plains without fixed walls, the knowledge that made a surveying party afraid of moving grass in the summer of 1872, survived. What is worth sitting with, at the end of this story, is not the defeat. It is the duration. For 10 years after the first surveyors walked into the Yellowstone country with their instruments and their military escort, the Lakota held their ground. Not because they were fiercer or more violent than the Army, but because they understood the land in a way the Army never did, and because that understanding was expressed not in fortifications or in massed firepower, but in the capacity to move, to dissolve, to disappear and reconstitute somewhere else, faster and more completely than a slow-moving industrial military machine could follow. The railroads feared the mobility before they understood it. The Army feared it before they found the one thing that could defeat it, not a faster army, but a vanished food supply. Rosser's diary note about the grass is 23 words long. He wrote it in pencil, quickly, and moved on to the next entry. But it is worth reading slowly, because in those 23 words is the whole texture of what it meant to ride into the Powder River country in 1872 and discover that the land was already fully occupied by people who had decided, 100 years before, that the way to hold a place was not to stay in it. Remember the names. Remember Sitting Bull, who smoked his pipe in the open ground before 1,000 soldiers to show them who controlled the pace of things. Remember Crazy Horse, who moved his people across frozen ground for a decade and fought the most powerful military in the hemisphere to something close to a standstill. Remember the women whose hands raised and lowered the lodges, who packed the travois and chose the route and arrived at the new camp and set up the teepee again before the sun had set, who were the engineers of the mobility that the surveyors feared and the generals could not defeat. They are the reason the grass moved. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.